Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoying the talks, the quality of discussion happening, and sad that I can't be there in person. So some context. So for the past couple of years, I've been leading a lab at UW, kind of continuing some of the stuff I did at MIT, focusing on the tool building side of the space to try and counter and reimagine these kind of dominant platform designs in the direction of greater user empowerment and social good. And that's going to be the focus of my talk. So, okay, so I think a lot of other people have already nicely described these problems. Not going to get into it. I think we're spending a lot of time in public debates, kind of debating where particular thresholds are, or the merits of this case or that case. And one of the things I want to argue is that I think this strategy is kind of getting us nowhere. Like we're stuck in a loop where we're hanging on the whims of a few people who have extreme amount of power, and we're not addressing some of the fundamental flaws with this entire setup of how content moderation happens on these major platforms. And so I want to talk about two specific assumptions about content moderation today that I would like to tackle as what I think is deeply flawed. So the first is that it is possible to come up with a single set of policies that will work well and can be consistently enforced across a large and diverse user base around the world. So on its face, I think this claim seems pretty preposterous. If you think about how different our different cultures are, our different norms across different communities, in-group language, offline culture, but also online culture, and the fast evolving nature of these norms. Here's a paper from Zhang and also Casey Fiesler, who's a part of this workshop, where they did some studies of this, and they found that this idea of, like, for instance, what is harmful content is something that varies quite significantly from country to country, and shows that does it really make sense to try to come up with a single universal set of rules for regulating all these users? Here's another project from a student in my lab looking at the kinds of values that people have on Reddit for their community. And it's quite diverse. It ranges from caring about things like how diverse the community is, or how high quality the content is, to the safety of that community. And you can imagine probably that different communities have pretty different values that its members care about. Even in these smaller communities, they're not a monolith either. So we also found that things like the value of safety has quite a lot of disagreement within communities about how important it is. And we also see differences according to what kind of role you have in the community as well. So maybe an old timer has different ideas of what's important than a newcomer. Moderators care about different things differently than regular users. And then the last point I wanted to make here is that harassment in particular, from some studies that we've done, is this thing that's just extremely contextual and extremely personal. So I wanted to pull out some example stories that I've heard from just people we've done interviews with. So, things like trans activists on YouTube receiving comments that are purposefully dead naming them or misgendering them. Instances of teenage bullying via these different kinds of like encoded or coded in jokes. One example was like these teen boys that were sending these dog barking messages to the girls in their school to insinuate that they were a female dog, and also stalking behavior. So the point I want to make here is that it can be really difficult to understand when someone's being harassed if you don't know the context, particularly if you're a stranger content moderator in like another country or something. And also people have different ideas about what is harassment to them. So that's the first assumption that I want to tackle. The second assumption that I want to tackle that is being made on many platforms today is this idea that users should have frictionless power to post and share, and yet no responsibility towards or power to shape the collective governance of that social space. So basically, there's this strong emphasis on the part of our platforms towards increasing speed and increasing scale. You could argue this is a consequence of our platforms being these private spaces that are monetizing our engagement, but whatever the cause, this is the effect. Faster spreading of content, more people who you can reach instantly, more content that's being consumed every day by every person. And I think if you take a step back and you really think about it, it's quite a huge shift from where we were. We've never talked or listened to other people's thoughts as much as we do today. And on the one hand, this kind of unprecedented ability to speak and be heard by more people than ever before is a pretty great source of power that the platforms have given us, power that we didn't used to have necessarily. And that's thanks to platforms that have really dedicated these efforts towards lowering barriers to speak and building really sophisticated authoring tools. But one problem with this is that the thing that hasn't really kept pace with all this talking is users' power to actually be able to curate or moderate or govern anyone's speech that's happening. So at the end of the day, once everyone's got a megaphone and everyone has the ability to speak, what becomes important then is not just the power to speak, but actually it becomes more about the power to curate how those discussions look and behave. And I want to argue that we don't really have good tools for this. And there's consequences to this. Like, we give people the ability to upvote and downvote things, but kind of the real shaping of speech, these large teams of content moderators, these recommendation algorithms that are being tweaked all the time. This is happening via the platform in a way that just doesn't really scale, or rather it scales in a way, but not in a way that's like good quality. So you get problems like spreading of false, ill-conceived messages, more ways for people to harass you, more moderators working under stressful conditions. So I want to ask, like, why is it that we give people this immense power to post, but little to no responsibility / power when it comes to the ramifications? And I say responsibility / power because I think they go together. Like the famous quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And in fact, I think Facebook used to have this really backwards rule that all speech from politicians is newsworthy. So if you're a politician with even greater reach and thus power than a regular user to post, you actually had fewer rules that you had to abide by. So they got rid of that after the Trump ban. But like there's this kind of like really inverse thing where if you have more power, you somehow had less responsibility. So I ask, okay, what if instead of this kind of consumer model of doing things like maybe the mall metaphor, we had more of like a citizen model of social media? You give back kind of to the platform. And this might be something that inconveniences people. Maybe you're not catered to as much as before. Maybe this might actually lower your platform's user metrics or engagement stats. Maybe that affects monetization. Maybe people post less. Maybe this only works in kind of like a public not-for-profit situation. I'm not sure. But this could actually help us scale up moderation to address these many problems, I argue. Okay, so instead of platforms where this one-size-fits-all moderation process that just doesn't fit everyone on the platform very well because it can't, and a platform where everyone has all this power to post all the time, but just no responsibility, little to no input into actual moderation. I argue that we need to put more moderation powers into the hands of users. And as a result of that, then not only can users localize and customize moderation to fit the rich norms of their specific different social settings or relationships, but by giving them this power, they can then become co-stewards in its future success in a way that can scale participation up as the number of people, as the number of participants goes up. Okay, so in a diagram, I guess, how should we do this? So we have, maybe hypothetically, we have platforms up here, or the platform level up here, including human moderators, classifiers, recommender algorithms. How do we move moderation closer to users? So there's a couple ways I've thought of. So one is, could we transfer some of the powers to users to customize moderation for themselves? That's one. Another is, okay, maybe we don't want everyone doing everything by themselves all the time. That seems like a lot of work and a lot of redundancy. Maybe we want users to be able to band together to moderate or be moderated as a collective. And then last, could we get more user input? Oh, input's there twice. User input when it comes to what governance powers platforms still wield, because maybe we still want some things that the platform's taking care of. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about some systems I've worked on that attempt to do some combination of these things in a way that's better than what's currently possible with platforms today. And I'll deep dive into a few of these, but in the interest of time, I'll just quickly mention some others. And first, I'm going to talk about PolicyKit. And PolicyKit is a tool that we built that's really aimed at that middle level of governance, which is kind of focused on this community level. And our observation when we kind of started to think about the space was we looked at all these platforms that host communities, all this software for online communities, and we noticed that there's actually very little diversity in how communities are governed and very few tools to support community governance. So when it comes to the governance model, they all kind of have this pattern of admins, mods, and users. And the way that admins and mods work is it's this kind of permissions model. The way the permissions model works is whenever a user wants to do something, like ban another user, etc., the system then goes and checks a permissions table that they have and sees whether that user has the permission to do that thing. If so, then the action's approved. So this is basically how this works and how governance happens on a lot of these communities. And in order to modify this table, so basically changing what the power structure is, only certain roles such as admins have the permission to do so. And so that's how it happens. And this roles and permissions model is really everywhere if you think about it. It's in all of our social kind of online community software, but it's also in a lot of our collaborative software, even down to like the access control for files in Unix-like operating system, which has been around for a very long time. So, so a permissions model can only describe a limited set of possible governance actions, though. So if you think about all the other places where you participate in communities, maybe offline, they don't always look like this. So for the most part, when we think about the governance online, it's going to be this kind of top-down, punitive, autocratic way of doing things. But if you wanted to have a different kind of governance, it's actually not that easy because you're kind of fighting against what the software defaults are. So either you have to carry it out manually in kind of an ad hoc way, or you have to maybe use and build one-off software bots that help you do something else. And at the end of the day, because this underlying software these communities are using has already embedded into it this idea of how governance should work, it takes effort to work around that. So we thought, okay, can we build tools that allow for a greater expression of governance and maybe governance that better supports how communities want to govern themselves? So to do this, we built PolicyKit, and this is a software infrastructure that empowers the members of an online community to be able to author a wide range of governance procedures and then be able to carry out those procedures on their home platform. And the way PolicyKit works is it tries to shift governance from this idea of articulating permissions, so basically that I can do this or you can do that, to articulating procedures, where procedures can express a much wider range of governance, such as participatory, democratic models. You can have elections, juries, direct democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Sky's the limit. And the way that works is instead of looking up a user's permissions via a permissions table, we look up and instead run policies. And these are policies written in Python using our tool PolicyKit that are these short procedural scripts that govern an action. So for instance, user A would like to do action X. We check the policy, and the policy says that first it must be approved by a majority of community members. And this is a script that's continually running and checking these policies. And if it can pass, then this action is approved. Okay. In addition, this process also modifies how can be used to modify the existing governance itself. So the permissions table in the past was used to actually be able to change how governance works. We can also use policies to change how the governance works here. So if I want to modify the policy governing how to do something, there is also a policy in PolicyKit that sets how that happens. And we, in the system, we distinguish these as like constitution policies versus platform policies. Okay, so I'm not going to go into exactly how to write policies, but just at a very high level, so you can see the code. It's not very long, and it's Python for now. So in the future, we want to work on kind of non-programmer friendly ways of specifying different kinds of policies, since there's a lot of well-known patterns of how governance works. And For instance, here we have kind of like a random jury system, but for now you write Python, and that means that you can kind of come up with almost any kind of governance you want. So this is a policy that sets up a random jury to vote on Slack channel renames, and there's kind of a couple things that you'd want to be able to do. So not going to go into that. But I just wanted to say one thing. So one thing you might be asking now is, okay, like, that's great, but how do I actually get this to work on all these platforms that I use? Like, do I have to wait for Slack or Reddit to implement PolicyKit in order to be able to start using it and to have all these different governance structures? And, what if they never bother to do that? So to fix that problem, we developed PolicyKit such that it is this kind of flexible third-party integration that can fit into any kind of community platform, so long as they have the proper APIs. So to actually have it govern your community, we have to do some things in order to be able to supersede the existing kind of like default admin mod governance that's happening on that platform already. And I'll explain how that works. Okay, so say a user's trying to rename a channel on Slack using the Slack interface. You've already installed this third-party extension into your app, into your Slack, and PolicyKit has these integrations with the platform such that we're listening to actions that are happening. We're checking those actions against policies hosted on the PolicyKit server. We're reverting things if things haven't passed yet, or if things fail. And then once we can actually determine that a policy can pass, such as, there's enough jury votes, for instance, after a period of time, we catch those, and then eventually we actually do the action that was attempted in the first place. So a little bit complicated, but basically what that means is that you can be governed by policies in PolicyKit, and you can also engage in governance, such as voting, deliberation, see a log of things that have happened directly from your platform of choice, whether that be Slack or Reddit or Discord, GitHub, etc., without having to go to a separate site. And then finally, if you did want to then dive in more or actually like author these policies, we have a separate website where you can like use our code editor to be able to author these policies. Okay, so that's a high-level PolicyKit. We have a couple of communities using it, haven't released it. Let me know if you'd like to try it. Okay, so PolicyKit is really trying to think about how to design different processes for online communities. And then I want to talk about a specific tool that we built for YouTube. And that is actually targeted to non-programmers, while PolicyKit kind of currently requires programmer support. Okay, so with YouTube, we were focusing on content creators, right? These are the kind of people at the middle level that are able to do things like moderate the comments on their YouTube videos. And here we were thinking about how to support content creators better. It turns out that content creators on YouTube, on a lot of these kind of influencer-oriented platforms, receive harassment of various kinds, such as identity-based attacks via comments. And as I mentioned earlier, we know that this kind of one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work. But not everyone's a programmer, so what do you expect people to do? It turns out that the tool that a lot of people use and that is available on many of these platforms is word filters. They have a lot of pros. They're easy to understand. People can customize them to the kind of harassment that they get because they can configure the specific words. But the way that they're implemented is really hardly usable. I mean, you can look at these screenshots we have of them implemented on these different platforms, and it's just a box where you put in some words. So we built a tool called Filter Buddy. Instead of just this comma-separated text box list of words, we implemented all these features that actually help people with this oftentimes difficult, fraught task of coming up with word filters, auditing what word filters are doing well, monitoring how word filters are catching things over time, being able to share word filters with each other, or take someone else's word filter and then like remix it for yourself. And some of these ideas that we had were like not really rocket science, like just felt like doing over the course of research, there's just tons of these basic usability things, kind of low-hanging fruit that platforms could be doing to be making creators' lives easier. So for instance, one feature that we implemented was like being able to see what kinds of comments would be caught when you come up with a new word to add to your word filter. Like that would be helpful to know if maybe you're catching things that you shouldn't be catching, but that doesn't exist on any of the platforms. So just kind of thinking about Filter Buddy and PolicyKit. These word filters that people are authoring using our tool are basically these very rudimentary, very constrained programs. Meanwhile, in something like PolicyKit, there's this like sky's the limit when it comes to what you can do, because you can write generic code. You can use anything. So PolicyKit and Filter Buddy, I would say, are kind of two ways of giving more governance power to communities and users. And one is doing it in a way that it's granting more flexibility and expressiveness to have different structures. The other one is improving usability and understandability. And ideally, we want both, knowing that there's some trade-offs between the two. We're interested in kind of more tools that explore how to give users more of both. Yes. Okay. And then turning back to this diagram, I also wanted to talk about this bottom level, tools that grant more power to users at the individual user level. So giving people the ability to control what they individually see. And the project I wanted to highlight here, was part of my PhD in collaboration with David Karger. He's actually going to be talking about this in more detail tomorrow. So I'm not going to go into it in detail. I'll just really quickly say that we did studies where we talked to people facing harassment. On YouTube, maybe they're getting public comments under their video, but in many cases, it's actually more like harassment in private, messages that you're getting sent to your email, for instance. Talked to a lot of people, all walks of life. We found some common things. One, related to the one-size-fits-all problem I mentioned earlier, people get harassed in very different contextual ways, really different ideas about what is harassment, different ideas about how they want to deal with it. And we also found that the most effective strategy was to give a password to a friend, have that friend go in and clean up their inbox. So here's an example. One person we talked to who has their friend go in and clean up their inbox for them. And this works because their friend actually knows the context and knows how they would like their harassment to be dealt. And so we built a whole system kind of based around this idea that, maybe tools could actually support this kind of behavior instead of people handing out passwords, where you could actually send some of your messages to a trusted person or people, and they could actually help you when you're kind of being inundated with a hate mob. Okay, but that's all I'll say about that. I'll just mention we have some ongoing work where we're thinking about how to design personal moderation tools. This is something that we're starting to see more in industry. So for instance, Instagram last year introduced this feature which allowed people to set personal preferences for what they called sensitive content or borderline content, instead of the platform kind of enforcing one thing for everybody. I think there's still a lot of really interesting questions about how to do this in kind of like an ethical way. If you recall, there was this fiasco that happened when Intel released this demo last year, where they, had the idea of letting people decide what levels they want of different things. But this led to this really awkward situation where you could say something like, yes, give me all the ableism and body shaming comments. Like that doesn't seem great. So I think there's a lot of questions about how to design these personal moderation tools still. Okay, so then moving from the user level, I want to go back to the platform level, the area where I said, okay, like let's have a lot less of that. But in some cases, you might still want some kind of moderation that's happening at the platform level. So clearly harmful things or illegal things. Maybe in some cases you do want a top-down approach that can override, in some cases, the preferences of a community or an individual user. So this brings us back to this original problem. Like, what do we do when we have this centralized model of moderation? So in this line of work, we went and asked this question of, are there ways we can design platform moderation such that it could be perceived as more legitimate. And specifically, we're looking at different aspects of these concepts from political science, like procedural justice, perceived legitimacy, and also democratic legitimacy. So can we take inspiration from how governance happens in offline spaces in democratic countries to understand how we could potentially do this in this very centralized, large platform setting. So specifically for the first study we went and built a platform where people could convene digital juries and think about the civil jury system as perhaps a model for how platform decisions could be made more legitimate. So I won't go into the details of how we did this study, but we built a system, we ran a study, convened various juries to look at content and deliberate on it. And some things that we found. So one, the participants in our study felt that there was greater legitimacy when it came to juries as opposed to the status quo, which is, that there's a combination of algorithms and a paid content moderator deciding on these decisions. We also found that deliberating juries was rated as higher care of personal preferences than blind voting. So we had different styles of juries and tested people's perceptions of those. And there were some kind of mixed results about how people thought about juries. So there are some, people who really distrusted the platform, but there are also other people who really distrusted other jurors, as well as different ideas about what people thought was fair. Is it better to have a lot of different perspectives or bias, or worry about biasing opinions? Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention is, so we did a follow study where we compared algorithms, paid contractors, expert panels, and digital juries to see how these processes impacted perceived legitimacy. And we also asked this question, how does the alignment of the outcome to one's personal preference influence the perceived legitimacy? And so these findings were a little bit harder to swallow. So a panel of experts in the end performed better overall. So this mistrust in juries still was kind of still there. However, users preferred group decision-making over individuals. And then this was kind of the kicker. Overall, though, we found that no matter what process we showed to people really thought something was more legitimate if the outcome matched their personal preference. Okay, so my thoughts on these studies. I think legitimacy could be improved with process. Though the things that people think are more legitimate are already also harder to scale. At the end of the day, outcomes matter. Maybe we're seeing that right now with the Supreme Court. And also crowd approaches such as juries, we have to contend with issues such as mistrust. And mistrust in algorithms was also something that we saw in our studies. Okay, so to summarize, we looked at tools for governance in online social communities, design of legitimate processes platform-wide, tools at the community level for self-governance, and tools for users to be able to better control what they see. I think I'm out of time, so I had a few other slides, but I'm gonna go ahead and open it up to questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Amy. Do we have questions from the audience? Sure.
Amy, this is Charlton Gillespie. Thank you so much for this. I love all of this thinking, and I love the impulse to kind of move some of these practices in the directions you're moving them. I had a question about PolicyKit, because I feel like while I like the idea of switching things around from permission setting to policy crafting, is it such that the only things you could create policies about are things that have permissions built in, right? So your example was, can I rename the channel? Which, if I don't follow the policy, I won't be able to do it. But if I want to set a policy that said, no political topics unless it's approved by 2 people, there's no mechanism to discern that the post someone just did is or is not political unless there's like a moderation process. Is there a way for PolicyKit to craft policies that grapple with that kind of like discernment, or do they function largely on top of things that have a permission built in so that the system stops you until the policy has been followed? Or is that the wrong question?
Okay, so let me try to answer that. So yes, we do kind of, the things that we can stop you from doing are things that are kind of discernible actions on the platform that we can access via the platform API. But in the case that you gave, I would argue that that is one of those because it's about posting. Posting is an action that people can do. And if you wanted to write a policy that, stops people from posting or, lets them post, but then, the post could be taken down later based off of like retroactive, like looking at the post, and that can be done by a human. It doesn't have to be completely computational. Then yes, you could write a policy for that using the system.
Okay, so it would have to be built on the action. So either it's the post doesn't happen until it's been approved, or the post could come down if it's not approved, but it's not that the post goes up if the sense is that it's the right kind of post. I mean, I guess you still hinge it to the actionable moment. Maybe that's true about almost all moderation, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
You can, so yeah, the pattern that I showed kind of, it's triggered by some action that's happening on the platform, and then the policy kind of, unfurls. But you can also write a policy that just triggers on itself. So like maybe it's a time-based policy, or it's, some other thing that is going on. So you could write a code that says like, if it's a Wednesday, then today is like only post yo day or something. So you could do something like that.
Cool. Thank you. That's fascinating.
Hi. So your thoughts about sort of letting people have more control, with sliders of, I want to see less of this, more of this, whatever, and the problems that causes, and also the things it enables, brought me back to one of the earlier talks where we were talking about the distinction between search and recommendation. And I wonder if you have thoughts on whether that model would be a better choice for search or a better choice for recommendations where there was not like an explicit search already done, or whether, that's not a distinction that matters.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I could see it being useful in both cases. And I think, I have to go check. I think in the case of Instagram, it does impact both search and sort of what you see in the Discover tab, as well as what you see in your feed. And yeah, I mean, in the interviews that we've done, we primarily talk to people about the kinds of things they're seeing on their feed and whether they want to have things removed on their feed. And some things that people have talked to us about is this idea of FOMO. So like, maybe I think I'm a resilient person, so I'm going to go ahead and put the most permissive setting because I don't want to miss out. But people would then say like, oh, but I think my sister or like my mom, like they should have the most restrictive setting, and I'm going to like, if I had this tool, I would like try to set that for them. So that was kind of interesting to see. Just as an aside. But I do think that maybe you'd have more of this issue of encountering things that are concerning that you aren't worried about missing out on if it's in a search setting. So that could be something to ask about, is in search, maybe some of these filters would actually be even more useful.
Since nobody else is asking it, I guess just that also makes me almost think that there should be more power for users to refine search results even outside the setting of like content moderation, right? Like imagine having the ability to do a Google search and then saying, oh, here's I guess they even kind of have this, right? There's oh, did you want more about, dogs or more about grass or more about, other things that were in your search? And I feel like we're only starting to scratch the surface of like honing what people are actually hoping to get out of these services. I don't know, just makes you think.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that there's just so much more room for tools for users that give them more powers to be able to do these things. I think there's research that we have to do to figure out what's like too much, like too complicated, requires too much knowledge of like programmatic concepts, versus like what are things that people say that they want, but then when they actually get it, they don't actually end up using it. So I think there's a lot that we could design there. For instance, I personally think that this idea of putting all of these tools in a separate settings page kind of dooms the fact that they will be used at all, because people don't bother to go over there. So better integration with when people are actually encountering things that they would prefer not to see, I think would be better. But yeah, we still need to design better systems that can actually help people in that moment.
All right. I'd like to take the privilege of the last question. This is looking ahead to tomorrow, when I'm going to be talking more about the bottom layer of your tree, the individual. And because of that, I wanted to ask what you think about what is the role or necessity for communities. Historically in the physical world, a community occupied a shared physical space, and there had to be a consensus choice about how much noise there would be in the space and such. But in virtual worlds or in online communities, it seems there's a lot more room for everybody to go their own way. So what's the role of community level policies and governance in that sort of changed virtual world?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite important. I think that being able to define a set of norms for a particular group of people can be really valuable for setting the context of discussion, setting the context of how people should behave within that space. That is just going to become a lot more chaotic when it's just lots and lots of peer-to-peer connections. And I do think that when working with community software and thinking about having more individual tools such as blocking or muting of things, such that different people in the community are now seeing different things, I think that does break down this sort of like common ground to a degree. And we have to be a little bit careful about how much we let people do that in a community, because that might make it such that it's harder to have conversations.
All right. Thanks very much, Amy.